Welcome. Today's story comes from post-Civil War Louisiana, 1867, a time when freedom existed on paper, but fear still ruled the land. This is not a legend told for comfort. It's a record buried in violence, silence, and survival. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value stories built on deep research, real records, and painful truth, please subscribe, because uncovering history like this takes countless hours of digging where most never look. In 1867, Louisiana, plantations were gone, but power never truly left the hands that once owned people. Formerly enslaved children wandered between freedom and danger, carrying scars deeper than chains. Among them was a boy, young, quiet, and underestimated, who would soon become the most feared name whispered across parishes. He had grown up watching punishment without mercy. He learned early that justice did not protect boys like him. What separated him from others was not rage, but patience. He listened. He remembered faces, voices, and cruelty with terrifying clarity. When the killings began, no one suspected a child. 19 members of the same family fell over time. Some vanished, some were found, some were never spoken of again. The pattern was invisible to those who refused to believe an enslaved boy could outthink grown men. Fear spread faster than truth. Rumors blamed gangs, outsiders, even curses. Meanwhile, the boy moved silently through a society that still refused to see him as human, only property, even after emancipation. By the time authorities began to understand, the damage was complete. Records were altered. Testimonies disappeared. The story was buried, not because it wasn't true, but because it terrified those who benefited from forgetting it. What remains today is a question history avoids. What happens when a child raised in brutality learns the system's rules better than its masters? Louisiana never fully answered that, and perhaps that's why this story still echoes. In 1867, Louisiana stood in a fragile space between slavery and freedom. The Civil War had ended, but its violence lingered in every parish, plantation, and dirt road. Laws said formerly enslaved people were free, yet daily life told a different story. White landowners still controlled land, weapons, courts, and money, while black families lived under constant threat from militias, night riders, and unofficial enforcers who rejected emancipation. Plantations did not disappear, they simply changed names. Sharecropping replaced chains, but hunger and debt kept many black families trapped on the same soil where their parents had been enslaved. Contracts were written to confuse, wages were withheld, and violence was used to enforce obedience. Freedom existed, but only within boundaries drawn by fear. Louisiana's legal system offered little protection. Courts rarely believed black witnesses, especially children. Crimes against formerly enslaved people were ignored or mislabeled as accidents. Sheriffs often worked with former slaveholders, ensuring that justice favored those who already had power. Children born into slavery faced the cruelest transition. Too young to understand freedom, yet old enough to carry trauma, they moved through a world that offered no safety. Many were orphaned by war, disease, or punishment, left to survive on instincts shaped by cruelty. Racial tension filled the air. White families feared retaliation, while black communities feared survival itself. Every rumor of rebellion or violence was exaggerated, feeding paranoia and leading to collective punishment. Trust between races was impossible, and silence became a form of protection. Violence during Reconstruction was often unofficial but constant. Lynchings, beatings, and disappearances were rarely recorded. When deaths occurred, authorities looked away, especially if the victims were black. History, as written, erased these moments intentionally. This was the Louisiana that shaped fear, where law meant little, memory meant everything, and a child raised in bondage learned early that survival required watching, waiting, and understanding a broken system better than those who enforced it. Reconstruction was meant to rebuild the South, but in Louisiana, it became an extension of war by other means. Federal troops were present in name, yet protection was inconsistent and often withdrawn without warning. Former Confederates, angered by defeat, formed armed groups to reclaim control through intimidation and bloodshed. Nighttime violence became routine. Armed riders moved across rural roads, targeting black families who attempted to vote, leave plantations, or demand fair pay. Homes were burned, men were dragged away, and bodies were left as warnings. These acts were rarely punished, sending a clear message that freedom could be taken as easily as it was declared. Law enforcement often turned a blind eye or actively participated. Sheriffs and judges were frequently former slaveholders or their allies. Complaints from black citizens were dismissed and investigations stalled before they began. Violence became invisible on paper, even as it dominated real life. Children witnessed this brutality up close. They learned that screams brought danger, that silence meant survival. Trauma shaped their understanding of power, teaching them that strength belonged to those willing to use violence without consequence. White families lived in fear as well, but of a different kind. They feared loss of dominance, retaliation, and the collapse of the racial order they had always known. Rumors of uprisings spread quickly, fueling paranoia and preemptive cruelty. This cycle created a landscape where violence felt inevitable. Revenge, justice, and survival blurred together. In such an environment, a single act could echo for years, and a child shaped by this chaos could become something the entire region feared, without anyone ever seeing it coming. Children who survived slavery entered Reconstruction already broken by experiences no child should carry. Many had watched parents beaten, sold, or killed. Some were born on plantations where pain was routine and affection was rare. By the time freedom arrived, innocence had already been taken from them. Unlike adults, these children had no memory of a life outside bondage. Freedom felt abstract, even dangerous. They were expected to obey old masters, adapt to new rules, and survive without guidance. Orphan children wandered between farms, towns, and camps, often exploited for labor or abandoned entirely. Trauma shaped their behavior. Silence, withdrawal, and hyper-awareness became survival tools. They learned to read tone, footsteps, and facial expressions with precision. Anger was buried deep, not expressed openly, because expression invited punishment. Education was promised, but rarely delivered. Schools for black children were attacked or burned, and teachers were threatened. Without structure or protection, many children grew up learning from violence rather than books, shaping their understanding of power and consequence. White society viewed these children with suspicion. They were labeled dangerous, wild, or incapable of reason, myths used to justify continued control. Any mistake was magnified, any resistance punished harshly, reinforcing cycles of fear and resentment. For some, survival meant disappearing into the background. For others, it meant adapting in darker ways, learning when to move, when to strike, and when to remain unseen. In a world that offered no mercy, even a child could become something feared, not by choice, but by necessity. After emancipation, the plantation justice system did not disappear, it simply changed form. Former slaveholders continued to act as judges, enforcers, and witnesses within their own communities. Disputes involving black laborers were handled privately, away from courts, ensuring outcomes that favored landowners every time. Punishment was swift and often brutal. Accusations required no evidence, especially when made against black men or children. Beatings, confinement, and forced labor were common responses to even minor offenses. The goal was not justice, but control, maintaining the same power structure slavery had enforced. Children were especially vulnerable. A boy accused of theft, disrespect, or wandering could be punished as harshly as an adult. There were no appeals, no protections, and no voices willing to defend them. Fear replaced law as the primary form of order. Local authorities supported this system through silence. Sheriffs ignored complaints, and courts dismissed cases involving plantation discipline as internal matters. This allowed abuse to continue unchecked, reinforcing the belief that black lives existed outside legal protection. White families trusted this system because it served them. It ensured labor remained cheap, obedient, and replaceable. Any challenge to plantation authority was labeled dangerous, criminal, or rebellious. Within this environment, justice lost all meaning. Right and wrong were defined by power alone. For a child raised under such a system, the lesson was clear: the law would never save you. Understanding that truth could turn fear inward, or sharpen it into something far more dangerous. Emancipation did not end fear in Louisiana, it multiplied it. White families, suddenly stripped of legal ownership, lived with a constant anxiety that those they once controlled might seek justice, revenge, or equality. This fear was not based on facts, but on guilt and the knowledge of what had been done in slavery's name. Rumors became weapons. Any disagreement, disappearance, or unexplained death was blamed on freed people. Stories of uprisings spread without evidence, turning ordinary movements into imagined threats. These rumors justified preemptive violence and tightened racial boundaries even further. Formerly enslaved people felt fear from every direction. Freedom offered no safety, only exposure. Walking alone, speaking confidently, or refusing unfair work could provoke deadly retaliation. Black families learned to lower their voices, avoid eye contact, and disappear from public spaces whenever possible. Children absorbed this fear deeply. They saw adults humiliated and punished for imagined offenses. They learned that being noticed was dangerous, and that survival depended on understanding white fear better than white law. This created a generation trained not by schools, but by terror. White communities responded by arming themselves. Vigilante groups patrolled roads, monitored black gatherings, and enforced invisible boundaries. These groups acted outside the law, but were protected by it, strengthening a culture where violence felt righteous. Racial fear poisoned every interaction. Trust collapsed, humanity was denied, and suspicion replaced reason. In this environment, fear became a self-fulfilling force, creating the very violence it claimed to prevent and shaping children into symbols of terror long before they understood why. The violence of Reconstruction Louisiana did not vanish, it was buried. Official records from the period are filled with gaps, vague language, and deliberate omissions. Deaths were labeled as accidents, disappearances were ignored, and investigations were quietly abandoned. What could not be denied was simply never written down. When crimes involved black victims, especially children, paperwork often stopped at the county line. Coroners avoided listing causes of death, and witnesses were pressured into silence. Testimonies that challenged powerful families were destroyed or never collected in the first place. Local newspapers played a role in this erasure. Stories that threatened white authority were minimized, reframed, or omitted entirely. If mentioned at all, victims were described without names, reducing human lives to statistics or rumors. Formerly enslaved people understood the danger of speaking. Reporting violence could invite retaliation, eviction, or death. Silence became protection, passed down through families as survival wisdom. Memories survived orally, whispered rather than recorded. Children grew up in a world where truth existed only in fragments. They learned that history was controlled by those with power, and that justice required more than evidence, it required permission. This understanding shaped how they viewed authority forever. As years passed, the absence of records became its own form of control. Without documents, accountability vanished. What remained were shadows, stories incomplete, crimes unpunished, and a past intentionally blurred so that fear could never be traced back to its source. The violence of Reconstruction Louisiana did not vanish, it was buried. Official records from the period are filled with gaps, vague language, and deliberate omissions. Deaths were labeled as accidents, disappearances were ignored, and investigations were quietly abandoned. What could not be denied was simply never written down. When crimes involved black victims, especially children, paperwork often stopped at the county line. Coroners avoided listing causes of death, and witnesses were pressured into silence. Testimonies that challenged powerful families were destroyed or never collected in the first place. Local newspapers played a role in this erasure. Stories that threatened white authority were minimized, reframed, or omitted entirely. If mentioned at all, victims were described without names, reducing human lives to statistics or rumors. Formerly enslaved people understood the danger of speaking. Reporting violence could invite retaliation, eviction, or death. Silence became protection, passed down through families as survival wisdom. Memories survived orally, whispered rather than recorded. Children grew up in a world where truth existed only in fragments. They learned that history was controlled by those with power, and that justice required more than evidence, it required permission. This understanding shaped how they viewed authority forever. As years passed, the absence of records became its own form of control. Without documents, accountability vanished. What remained were shadows, stories incomplete, crimes unpunished, and a past intentionally blurred so that fear could never be traced back to its source. In post-Civil War Louisiana, power never truly shifted, it only changed its appearance. Freedom was declared, but control remained firmly in the hands of white landowners, former slaveholders, and local officials who shared the same interests. Land, weapons, money, and law all pointed in one direction, leaving black communities powerless in practice. Formerly enslaved people had no economic leverage. Without land or legal protection, they depended on the very families who once owned them. Refusing work, questioning treatment, or attempting independence could result in eviction, violence, or fabricated criminal charges. Survival meant submission. The imbalance was most brutal for children. A black child had no authority, no voice, and no protection. Adults could accuse them without evidence, punish them without consequence, and erase them without record. Childhood offered no shield, only vulnerability. White families understood this imbalance and relied on it. Authority was enforced through fear rather than law. A reputation alone could destroy a black family, while white perpetrators were protected by silence and social ties. This uneven distribution of power shaped behavior on both sides. Black communities learned caution, restraint, and invisibility. White communities grew accustomed to dominance, rarely questioning their right to control outcomes. For a child growing up inside this imbalance, the lesson was unmistakable: justice was not neutral, and innocence offered no safety. Power decided truth, understanding that reality could break a spirit or harden it into something capable of terrifying those who once believed they were untouchable. In a world so deeply unequal, fear did not come from strength. It came from knowing that the powerless, when pushed far enough, might find ways to reclaim control outside the system designed to deny it. Psychological trauma was an invisible wound carried by nearly every child who survived slavery and Reconstruction. Long before freedom, their minds were shaped by fear, unpredictability, and loss. Violence was not an event, it was a condition of daily life, teaching children that safety could vanish at any moment. These children learned to stay alert at all times. Sudden noises, raised voices, or unfamiliar footsteps triggered panic. Sleep was restless, filled with memories they could not escape. Without comfort or counseling, trauma hardened into permanent vigilance. Emotional expression became dangerous. Crying, anger, or defiance often led to punishment. Children learned to suppress feelings, creating emotional numbness as a form of self-defense. Over time, empathy dulled, not because it disappeared, but because showing it felt unsafe. Memory itself became fractured. Some moments were burned deeply into the mind, while others faded or vanished entirely. Trauma distorted time, making past horrors feel constantly present. For many, the line between survival and aggression blurred. White society misunderstood these psychological scars. Trauma responses were labeled as savagery, disobedience, or moral failure. Instead of care, children were met with suspicion and discipline, reinforcing cycles of harm. For a child raised in this environment, trauma could become a source of power as much as pain. Fear sharpened awareness, and emotional distance allowed difficult choices. What began as survival instincts could evolve into something far more dangerous when a traumatized mind learned that fear, not mercy, controlled the world around it. By the late 1860s, terror had become a shared language in parts of Louisiana. Violence no longer shocked, it warned. Entire communities lived with the understanding that safety was temporary and conditional. One incident could bring punishment to many, regardless of guilt. For black communities, terror was constant and personal. Armed patrols, sudden arrests, and disappearances created an atmosphere where people expected loss. Families prepared for nights when someone might not return. Silence, obedience, and avoidance were survival strategies passed from neighbor to neighbor. White communities experienced a different terror, fear of losing control. Every rumor of resistance, every unexplained event, was treated as proof that order was collapsing. This fear fed aggression, turning suspicion into action before facts could intervene. Children absorbed this fear without explanation. They learned to read tension in adults' voices, to recognize when danger was near, and to disappear when necessary. Terror shaped their understanding of community, not as protection, but as exposure. Public punishment reinforced this climate. Violence was often carried out openly to send messages, ensuring fear traveled faster than truth. Witnessing suffering became a lesson, obedience preserved life. Over time, terror replaced trust. Neighbors avoided each other. Conversations ended abruptly, and collective strength dissolved. In such an environment, fear became contagious, and once fear ruled the community, even a child could move unseen, guided by the chaos terror creates. In Reconstruction-era Louisiana, many crimes were never meant to be solved. Violence operated in shadows, protected by silence, loyalty, and fear. What appeared on the surface as accidents, disappearances, or misfortune often concealed deliberate acts carefully hidden from the law. Powerful families knew how to erase evidence. Bodies were buried without records, deaths went unreported, and witnesses were intimidated into forgetting what they had seen. When questions arose, they were redirected or shut down entirely. The truth was not denied, it was buried. Hidden crimes thrived because the system allowed them to. Law enforcement lacked incentive to investigate wrongdoing by white citizens, especially influential ones. When the victims were black, cases quietly disappeared, justice was selective, and secrecy became routine. Rumors filled the gaps left by missing facts. Communities whispered about what really happened, but no one spoke openly. Fear ensured cooperation. Knowing too much could make someone the next disappearance. Children grew up understanding this unspoken code. They learned that wrongdoing was not punished, it was concealed. That knowledge reshaped how they viewed morality, teaching them that survival sometimes depended on operating outside visibility. In a world where crimes were hidden by design, truth became dangerous, and within that darkness, someone small, overlooked, and underestimated could move freely, because hidden systems are most vulnerable to those who already live unseen. In the violent and chaotic landscape of post-Civil War Louisiana, many victims of brutality were never remembered. The official records, newspapers, and even oral histories often ignored the lives lost, especially those of black children and families. Names, faces, and stories were erased, leaving only numbers or whispers where lives had once existed. Forgotten victims were often the most vulnerable children who witnessed horrors, families without influence, and individuals caught in the crossfire of racial and social power struggles. Their deaths went unrecorded, uninvestigated, and unacknowledged, as if the community had collectively decided that some lives were not worth noting. The erasure was both deliberate and systemic. Authorities protected perpetrators by refusing to document crimes, Landowners controlled narratives to preserve reputation, and fear ensured that witnesses remained silent. As a result, entire communities had gaps in memory, and the victims' stories were lost to history. Survivors carried these memories privately, passing them down quietly to family members or neighbors. These stories often became distorted, partial or shrouded in fear, but they were the only threads connecting the living to those who had been erased. Oral tradition preserved fragments, but the lack of written evidence made it nearly impossible for outsiders to verify or understand the full extent of the suffering. Children growing up amid such erasure learned a grim lesson in a world where justice ignored them and society forgot them. Only the cautious, the clever, or the ruthless could survive. Awareness of these forgotten victims shaped behavior, creating a generation hyper-aware of power, danger, and the fragility of life. In the end, the forgotten victims were a silent force in history. Their absence spoke as loudly as any record, shaping fear, mistrust, and the caution that defined both communities and individuals navigating the treacherous social order of Louisiana after emancipation. In Louisiana during Reconstruction, violence against black communities was often not just ignored, it was actively concealed. Powerful families, local officials, and law enforcement worked together to hide crimes that could expose the instability of the post-slavery social order. These systemic cover-ups ensured that perpetrators faced little or no accountability. Records were manipulated or destroyed. Deaths were misclassified as accidents or illnesses. Disappearances were written off as runaways, and reports of abuse were suppressed. Even when witnesses tried to come forward, they were intimidated, bribed, or threatened into silence. The system was designed to protect white authority and maintain the illusion of control. Cover-ups extended beyond the law. Newspapers, the main record keepers of public events, often ignored stories that would reflect badly on the local elite. When stories were reported, they were sanitized or twisted to place blame on victims rather than perpetrators. Public perception was managed carefully to ensure fear and obedience remained intact. Children observed these patterns closely. They learned that wrongdoing could be invisible if hidden skillfully, and that authority was not synonymous with justice. Every cover-up reinforced the lesson that power, not truth, governed survival. These hidden acts also created a culture of mistrust within the black community. Families understood that even truth could be dangerous, so caution and secrecy became essential survival tools. What could not be spoken aloud had to be remembered privately, passed down cautiously to the next generation. Ultimately, systemic cover-ups allowed violence to continue unchecked. The combination of fear, secrecy, and power imbalance created an environment in which individuals, especially those underestimated like a young enslaved boy, could operate in ways the system could never anticipate or control. In such a society, hidden strength often outmatched overt authority. In post-Civil War Louisiana, survival and revenge were often intertwined, especially for those who had endured the horrors of slavery. For formerly enslaved individuals, every day presented a choice: comply with oppressive power and survive, or resist and risk death. The line between survival and revenge blurred when injustice was constant and inescapable. Children, in particular, learned early that survival required vigilance, cunning, and sometimes calculated aggression. Observing the cruelty inflicted upon their families and communities, they understood that mercy was rare, and that protection often came from knowledge, foresight, and the ability to act decisively. Small acts of defiance could mean life or death, and over time, these acts became lessons in strategy and patience. Revenge was not always spontaneous. It was often deliberate, a slow response to accumulated trauma. For a child who witnessed the systematic abuse of family members, the desire to strike back could grow quietly, hidden under a facade of obedience. Revenge became a tool for reclaiming agency in a world where legal justice was impossible. The social context amplified this tension. Communities living under constant fear could neither openly support acts of retaliation nor trust authorities to protect them. As a result, individuals, sometimes children, learned to operate in secrecy, waiting for the moment when action would be both necessary and possible. This dynamic created a dual mindset. On one hand, survival demanded patience, discretion, and silence. On the other, revenge demanded observation, memory, and courage to act. Together, they shaped individuals who were hyper, aware of threats and opportunities alike, capable of responding with calculated precision. In the case of Louisiana's most feared enslaved boy, these lessons manifested in chilling ways. He had grown up balancing survival with the desire for justice against those who had harmed him and his community. The acts he committed were a product of trauma, strategy, and circumstance, an extreme illustration of how survival instincts and revenge can merge in a world defined by violence. Ultimately, survival and revenge were not just personal strategies, they were responses to a society that denied humanity to an entire people. For some, the only way to endure was to turn the lessons of oppression into methods of power, ensuring that fear could shift, even temporarily, into their own hands. In Louisiana after the Civil War, fear shaped not only daily life, but also the record of history itself. Violence, injustice, and survival stories of black communities were often deliberately omitted from official accounts. What frightened the powerful was rarely documented, because acknowledging it would challenge social hierarchies and reveal the failures of law, authority, and the post-emancipation system. Fear dictated which stories were preserved and which were forgotten. Victims of brutality, especially children, were frequently erased from newspapers, court records, and local archives. Families who tried to record their experiences risked retaliation, and oral histories, though rich, were dismissed as gossip or rumor. This selective memory ensured that fear could dominate both the present and the historical narrative. For children growing up in this environment, the lessons were stark. They learned that speaking the truth could be dangerous, and that silence often ensured survival. They saw entire communities comply with injustice to avoid punishment, while crimes committed by the powerful went unchallenged. History itself became a tool to control perception and maintain dominance. The erasure of these events had long-term consequences. Generations were left unaware of the full scope of trauma, courage, and resistance in their communities. Without written records, the true stories of suffering, survival, and retaliation faded into shadows, accessible only through painstaking research or oral traditions. In cases like Louisiana's most feared enslaved boy, Fear amplified the invisibility of his actions. While some whispered about his deeds, official history failed to record them in full detail, leaving a terrifying legend rather than a documented truth. This gap demonstrates how fear can control not only behavior, but also memory. Ultimately, history erased by fear serves as both a warning and a challenge. It shows how power can manipulate truth and how terror can silence entire communities. But it also highlights the resilience of those who survived, remembered, and passed down fragments of the past, ensuring that even if history was altered, it was never completely lost.